Hello and welcome to Conquest Weekly Podcast. My name is Cody, lead developer and creator of what I'm calling Conquest Card Game. Currently, Conquest is a card game that aims to blend TCG and RTS components together. The the idea for the game I came up with it about 8 years ago. Originally planned it for a physical TCG release, but the cost to do that stopped me. About 2 years ago, I began programming the game in C++ and SFML from scratch, but I encountered several bugs that I personally wasn't able to overcome at the time. And now I have published a couple of mobile games, gotten better at making games, and I've restarted development on Conquest. This podcast will be weekly and will focus on the different parts of the development of Conquest. And this first podcast is going to start with the story. The game will have an offline single player story and online multiplayer. The world and the story are both original works written by myself and a good friend, Casey Peerfoy, who is a writer, and we have compiled a creation and lore Bible, and we will read some of that lore today and kind of go into the decision making for the stories. But before we do that, I want to talk about the races in the game. We have uh, two goddesses that kind of rule this world that we created, and so they make up the gods. We also have elves, beastmen, demons, men, elementals. And this lore Bible will kind of go into the creation of all of them. Okay, so just to dive in, I have it written out here. We have the beginning. In the beginning of the world, only Gadaeus existed, a sentient ball of dust alone in the dark. Gadaeus' loneliness caused her to weep. She wished for light and a companion. She wept a single tear. The tear began to glow and morph into the shape of a woman. Thus the first daughter of Gadaeus was born, as the goddess of light. She was a being of purity and love, filled with only happiness. The goddess held up her hand and created the sun. Its light washed over the empty planet that was her mother, and she felt her mother's joy. For a while she traveled the land and created what would fill the world. She made plants and animals. She wanted something of her own she could create. The goddess Light then created the bright elves, beautiful, gifted with some of her magic. She loved the elves, and she loved all they created. So, we wanted a place to start the story that wasn't just like, boom, all of a sudden something exists. So we had a sentient mass that had power, but it lacked the ability to use the power to change anything. But by part of that power splitting into itself, it was able to change things for the world, and thus was the first goddess. Look upon the animals she had created. In her heart, the goddess wanted them to be able to create for themselves as well, selecting the animals that she felt would represent them fairly. The goddess gave them sentience and a body to create with. In that instance, the beast men were born. The goddess of light noticed that the creatures seemed to only exist with no real drive. The world's inhabitants had no reason to do anything. She prayed to her mother Gadaeus for someone like her that embodied everything she did not. The sadness of her daughter grieved Gadaeus, and she wept a single tear. The tear grew black and morphed into the shape of a woman, and the goddess of darkness was born. The goddess of light saw her sister, the goddess of darkness, and for the first time she felt sad. But this made her happy. The goddess of darkness saw her sister, the goddess of light, and for the first time she felt joy. But this made her sad. So here we have kind of a yin yang. You know, the saying it's hard to have good without bad because then everything's just normal. You wouldn't know it was good. And so this came from the fact that the goddess of light didn't want her creations to be empty and just existing like her mother Gadaeus did in the beginning before she was created. And so let's continue. Together the sisters felt complete and they loved each other. The goddess of light showed her sister all that she had created and the beings that embodied her. The goddess of darkness wanted her own creations, and began to make them. Thus the demons were born. Fearing what her creations could do to all her sister had created, she built a place to separate the two worlds. The goddess of light longed for her creations to feel purpose, so she asked her sister to give them negative emotions that would allow them to realize the happiness they have had. The goddess of darkness imbued the beings of light with the negative emotions, but it was too much for the elves. But it was too much, and the elves became cruel to the beings they saw below them. They decided to separate themselves from the rest of the world, especially the beastmen. These emotions caused the beastmen to become angry with all beings they felt were granted greater gifts from the goddesses. Together, the goddess of light and dark decided to create a new being. It would embody both goddesses' powers and decide justice for the world. Through this, they would see the world in its light and its darkness. Thus, mankind was born. I was just reading my notes. One moment. And so now we have the three kind of man-like races, and they have both positive and negative emotions, which is already beginning to cause a rift between them. And that was the beginning. And so now we're to the first war. The goddess of light and the goddess of dark took special interest in humankind and helped them in many ways. The most devout were given access to some of the goddess's magic. This angered both the elves and the beastmen. Because of their ability to adapt and think freely, humans flourished. To help fight hunger, the goddess of light granted some humans the knowledge of farming. To help protect themselves from carnivores, the goddess of darkness granted them knowledge of weapons. The humans grew until eventually they split into three large groups, needing more room to farm. One group began to cut down the forest around them, angering the beastmen. Tension rose until the beastmen began attacking farmers. The humans used their weapons to slay the small group of beastmen. When the goddesses saw this, the goddess of light was filled with grief. She sought comfort in her first creation, the elves. And so the three large groups that they split into will comprise three separate human factions in the card game that focus on different things. One will focus on magic and research. The other one will focus on augmentation effects, so effects that change the value of attributes of the cards. And another one will focus on fighting, or cards with good attack and defense. Now, the magic research will be split between the three groups. One group's effects will focus on resources and renewing health points for battlefield, stuff like that. They're essentially farmers. So their effects will focus on keeping your battlefields up and going. Back to the story. So the goddess entered the elves' secluded city-state, and she was taken aback by its beauty. Because of the ugliness of the elves' hearts has grown. The society was based on physical beauty or prowess. The less desirables were made slaves. Worse, she saw the elves had beastmen prisoners, using them for experiments with the magic she had given them. The goddess of light blamed her sister for turning elves into this. She was deeply hurt by her creations, and blaming her sister, she decided to slumber, in the hopes that the world would change before she awoke. The goddess of light went to the most secluded forest she had created. There she formed a group of centaurs to guard the area of the forest. In the center she created a crystal cocoon, where she began to sleep. And so this group of centaurs will be known as the hallowed centaurs, and they will be different from normal centaurs, bigger, stronger, faster, and more loyal to the goddess, more loyal to their mission to protect her and everything around her. And the world grew dark, and the battles between beastmen and humans became more frequent, while the elves grew more sadistic. The goddess of darkness eventually discovered her sister and felt that she had abandoned her. Without her sister there, the negative emotions and anger grew inside the goddess of darkness. She withdrew from the world and took solace in the realm she had created for her demons. Occasionally, the goddess of darkness allowed them to access the surface world. This was her way of punishing her sister's creations for driving them apart. As the war between beastmen and humans raged for hundreds of years, the inhabitants of Gadea began to create idols to worship. They worshipped ones they claimed to see in visions, and some of these gods were deities from other worlds. Through the prayers of the followers on Gadea, these powers gained access to the world of the goddesses. These deities would send soldiers to her faithful followers. And this will actually bring in another race that I failed to mention, and it will be angels or divine, which will be based on Christian angels or angels from Christian based or religions that are based in the same following as Christianity. But it's also based on the some Celtic lore. So some of the fairies that were the deities of the Celtic area, and through the faith that these people had in them, they were able to cross over into from essentially our world into the world of the goddesses. But as for the elves, since they were the first created, they knew what it was like to not have, to have nothing but everything be just happy and really have no feeling or no desire to do anything. If you're listening to this anywhere else but Patreon, this is where this uh, free section ends. The full version is available on the Patreon page. Thank you.